The Great Debate by Yuval Levin, continued, Disc 7. As the exercise of government requires talents and abilities, and as talents and abilities cannot have hereditary descent, it is evident that hereditary succession requires a belief from man to which his reason cannot subscribe, and which can only be established upon his ignorance. And the more ignorant any country is, the better it is fitted for this species of government. On the contrary, government, in a well-constituted republic, requires no belief from man beyond what his reason can give. He sees the rationale of the whole system, its origin and its operation, and as it is best supported when best understood, the human faculties act with boldness and acquire, under this form of government, a gigantic manliness. Paine actually raises Burke's own words in defense of this position, particularly Burke's assertion in the Reflections on the Revolution in France, "Government is a contrivance of human wisdom." See Chapter 4. In that passage, Burke is arguing that political institutions are not works of nature, but creations of man, though he downplays the difference between the two. But Paine rather deftly employs the reference to suggest that governing is an act of raw intellect. In Rights of Man, Paine argues, admitting that government is a contrivance of human wisdom, it must necessarily follow that hereditary succession and hereditary rights, as they are called, can make no part of it, because it is impossible to make wisdom hereditary. This is a crucial part of Paine's case against monarchy, that since governing is intellectual work, there is no reason to expect that the ability to govern well will be hereditary, and in any case no one could possibly be wise enough to be given as much power and privilege as a king is granted. For a man to merit £1,000,000 a year from a nation, he ought to have a mind capable of comprehending from an atom to a universe, which, if he had, he would be above receiving the pay, Paine writes. For this reason, the very fact of monarchy demonstrates, in Paine's view, an intentional rejection of a politics of reason. Hereditary succession is a burlesque upon monarchy. It puts it in the most ridiculous light, by presenting it as an office which any child or idiot may fill. This sort of superstition may last a few years more, but it cannot long resist the awakened reason and interest of man. In a society that properly understands the fully rational character of politics, no such practice could make sense. Such a politics of rational assessment, of course, relies on the premise that if reason is allowed free rein, the right choices will be made. Paine's republicanism rests on the view that reason is well, though not equally, distributed across society, and if left to its own devices, it will move the majority to both elect to power those with the greatest mental gifts and make the correct kinds of choices directly. It is always the interest of a far greater number of people in a nation to have things right than to let them remain wrong. And when public matters are open to debate and the public judgment free, it will not decide wrong, unless it decides too hastily. Paine, therefore, flatly disagrees with Burke's view that political judgment requires more wisdom than the unaided reason can muster, and that therefore long-standing and successful prejudices should be given some weight. No man is prejudiced in favor of a thing, knowing it to be wrong. He is attached to it on the belief of its being right, and when he sees it is not so, the prejudice will be gone. Long-standing use provides no exemption. The question is not whether those principles are new or old, but whether they are right or wrong. And a refusal to directly confront that question leads society to accept many wrongs and persist in much injustice, and especially in needless wars. In the emerging age of reason, the objects for war are exceedingly diminished, and there is now left scarcely anything to quarrel about, but what arises from that demon of society prejudice, and the consequent sullenness and untractableness of the temper, Paine writes in 1782. One crucial reason why society cannot easily overcome that demon of prejudice, Paine argues, is precisely the reliance on precedent that Burke values so highly. Government by precedent, without any regard to the principle of the precedent, is one of the vilest systems that can be set up, Paine writes. By associating those precedents with a superstitious reverence for ancient things, as monks show relics and call them holy, the generality of mankind are deceived into the design. Governments now act as if they were afraid to awaken a single reflection in man. They are softly leading him to the sepulchre of precedents, to deaden his faculties and call attention from the scene of revolutions. They feel that he is arriving at knowledge faster than they wish, and their policy of precedence is the barometer of their fears. Moreover, because the oldest precedents are valued most highly, the doctrine of precedents suggests that human history is a decline, that wisdom degenerates in governments as governments increase in age, and can only hobble along by the stilts and crutches of precedents. Paine thus rejects the view at the core of Burke's doctrine of prescription, that practices that have passed the test of time deserve respect and have gradually evolved to best meet the needs of the present. In fact, he argues, the practices of the past were not built upon reasoned knowledge and so do not provide a model of politics. Paine even objects to the employment of precedent not only in political life, but also in the law courts. And for the same reasons, he thinks the wisdom of many has no special standing over that of one. All must pass the same test of reason as employed by every individual. Paine thus flatly rejects the idea that party politics allows for many minds to work together, and that the limits of reason mean that parties are inevitable in a free society, as different people emphasize different parts of the truth in different ways. For Paine, the truth is knowable by reason and should be persuasive to all, and therefore parties in politics can only be factions in search of private ends over the public good. His ideal of a Republican legislature was always founded on a hope that whatever personal parties there might be in the state, they would all unite and agree in the general principles of good government, that these party differences would be dropped at the threshold of the State House, and that the public good, or the good of the whole, would be the governing principle of the legislature within it. A politics freed from prejudice and enlightened by reason need not be a politics of partisanship. Just as Burke's case for party emerges from his understanding of human nature and the limits of reason, so Paine's case against it is grounded in his own understanding of human nature and of the power of reason. Similarly, Paine dismisses the notion that each nation should follow the patterns of its own history and that no universal principles of political form or function can speak to all. Such a view, he argues, begins by assuming that politics has nothing to do with reason and knowledge, and so does not answer to principles of any kind, but only to contingent experience. If there is a case for monarchy, for instance, surely one group of Englishmen in Britain should be able to explain it to another in America, even if they live in different circumstances. If there is anything in monarchy which we people of America do not understand, I wish Mr. Burke would be so kind as to inform us, Paine writes. But in fact, the opposite is the case. I see in America a government extending over a country 10 times as large as England, and conducted with regularity for a 40th part of the expense which government costs in England. If I ask a man in America if he wants a king, he retorts and asks me if I take him for an idiot. How is it that this difference happens? Are we more or less wise than others? I see in America the generality of people living in a style of plenty unknown in monarchical countries. And I see that the principles of its government, which is that of the equal rights of man, is making a rapid progress in the world. Surely, if it is good for America, it will be good for others too, because it is verifiably grounded in accessible arguments. For all these reasons, Paine believes that Burke's concerns about the danger of uprooting long-standing prejudices and practices are misplaced, and that his politics, based as it is on the limits of reason, is misguided. It is not at all a misfortune that everything is to be discussed, Paine argues. Discussing everything openly is the means of rationalizing politics, and by so doing, the way to properly define, guide, and implement political change. Once basic principles like the equality of man and the necessity of consent are laid out, the kinds of gross injustice evident in so many of the regimes of the world become untenable. It is impossible that such governments as have hitherto existed in the world could have commenced by any other means than a total violation of every principle sacred and moral, Paine writes. He argues against Burke's assertion that these governments do most things well, and we should, therefore, not focus on the few things they fail to do. The truth is the opposite, Paine says. These governments' most basic forms are wrong, and the few things that do work are merely exceptions that prove the rule. A legitimate and working government, therefore, will combine the proper principles with their attendant forms. In this sense, politics really does answer to abstract principles for Paine, but it does so out of the conviction that the right principles are inescapable prerequisites for the right practices, and that once reason and proper principles are unleashed in political life, a course is irrevocably set that will lead to a fairer and more effective government. The revolution Paine has in mind is thus primarily one of knowledge enabled by reason, and those who oppose it are essentially agents of willful ignorance. Paine writes, "The revolutions of America and France have thrown a beam of light over the world, which reaches into man. The enormous expense of governments has provoked people to think by making them feel, and when once the veil begins to rend, it admits not of repair. Ignorance is of a peculiar nature. Once dispelled, it is impossible to re-establish it. Mr. Burke is laboring in vain to stop the progress of knowledge." A government founded on such advances in knowledge, therefore, argues for itself in rational terms in its very forms and functions. It makes its case explicitly, so that every citizen can consider the case, and it wears its principles on its sleeve. This means, for one thing, that the government must explicitly present its principles and forms to the world through a written constitution. Such a document, Paine argues, must give expression to the proper origin of government in a contract among the people, and is in effect the actual legal form of that contract. Such a constitution thus embodies what is known by reason about the origins of government and the nature of man, and it speaks in plain terms to the reason of every reasonable person, so that no one can question its legitimacy. What Burke calls the English Constitution, which is not a document but the actual forms and structures of the English government, is to Paine not a constitution at all, but just the accumulated practices of an essentially unjust regime. Their definitions of a constitution embody Burke's and Paine's views on reason and political change. For Burke, the Constitution is the product of prescription, and its defense is the aim of prescription. Paine believes that the Constitution is the product of explicit reasoning on abstract principles and is defended by reasoned argument. Burke's Constitution is a regime, if not a nation. Paine's Constitution is a legal document. A constitution, Paine writes, is not a thing in name only, but in fact. It has not an ideal, but a real existence. And wherever it cannot be produced in a visible form, there is none. Can, then, Mr. Burke produce the English Constitution? If he cannot, we may fairly conclude that though it has been so much talked about, no such thing as a constitution exists or ever did exist, and consequently that the people have yet a constitution to form. Such a straightforward constitution, which in plain black and white describes the government in rational terms and in its entirety, also greatly simplifies the function of government, and avoids the enormous and needless complexity and inefficiency of the English system, with its countless vestigial limbs retained out of pure inertia and unwillingness to change. This complexity is itself a mark of the unreasonable character of the British regime. Rationalization translates to simplification. I draw my idea of the form of government from a principle in nature which no art can overturn, namely, that the more simple anything is, the less liable it is to be disordered, and the easier repaired when disordered, Paine writes in Common Sense. This point again stands in for Paine's larger disagreement with Burke about the relation of political life to reason and science, as understood by the Enlightenment philosophers. Burke explicitly rejects the notion that simplicity in government is a virtue. Complicated institutions built up over time are far more likely to work well because they have developed to balance competing pressures and ambitions against one another. Human beings are not simple, and their governments cannot be either. When I hear the simplicity of contrivance aimed at and boasted of in any new political constitutions, I am at no loss to decide that the artificers are grossly ignorant of their trade, or totally negligent of their duty. The simple governments are fundamentally defective, to say no worse of them, Burke writes. But to practice politics by balancing countervailing excesses, Paine says, amounts to an accusation upon Providence, as if she had left to man no other choice with respect to government than between two evils. Since he does not believe that is the case, he rejects the kind of checks and balances approach to institutional design that characterizes even most liberal political philosophers, and argues that mixed government is unacceptable. Paine is in this respect a true Enlightenment radical, more like the French revolutionaries than the American. Burke's various defenses of the aristocracy and the prerogatives of the king always defend the whole mixed regime, the king, the nobles, and the common people balancing each other's interests to achieve a stable political life. I hold the Lords to be of absolute necessity in the Constitution, but I think they are only good when kept within their proper bounds, Burke writes. This, as he explains it, is why he defended Parliament against royal power grabs in the 1760s, but then became a staunch defender of the royal prerogative against the advocates of republicanism in the 1780s. But Paine believes that such instability and irregularity result from a failure to apply the proper principles to government. A mixed regime is a jumbled mess and falls short of legitimacy to the extent it falls short of true republicanism. For similar reasons, Paine does not generally advocate checks and balances within a republican regime. He does not argue that a very specific arrangement of the representative system is a necessary function of republican principles. It is a matter of preference as long as the representative principle is adhered to. But Paine's own preference is for simplicity and minimalism in institutional design. In Common Sense, he offers an idea of what he believes should be the shape of American self-government after the British are expelled. He calls for annually elected unicameral state assemblies with no state executives or governors. The assemblies are to be empowered over all domestic questions, but subject to the authority of the Continental Congress in foreign affairs. At the federal level, he wants the different states divided into equal districts that would each send a large number, perhaps 30 each, of representatives to the National Congress, which would also be a unicameral body. All votes in the Congress should require a 3/5 majority. The Congress would choose its president by drawing the states by lot, and each state in turn would have its chance to preside. Little to no discord could arise in such a structure, Paine suggests, as it would best represent the true will of the people while allowing for the rational assessment of political problems. The structure is aimed at facilitating rational decision-making and ignores almost entirely the role of ambition, interest, and passion in human affairs, all of which Paine takes to be avoidable by a proper attention to the correct principles of government. Paine's rejection of bicameralism, which he modified a little in the 1790s but never rejected during his career, is particularly telling in this regard. In Rights of Man, he argues that two houses arbitrarily checking or controlling each other is inconsistent, because it cannot be proved on the principles of just representation that either should be wiser or better than the other. These words were published in 1792 and probably written in late 1791, well after the adoption of the U.S. Constitution, which of course involved a very different institutional structure. Though Paine never says so explicitly, his constitutional writings of the 1790s strongly suggest he had serious principled objections to the design of the American constitutional system, with its complicated efforts to corral ambition and channel envy and the hunger for power through counteracting institutions. For Paine, simplicity in government is the appropriate expression of the simple and accessible truths that underlie it. Thus, he not only opposes intricate designs in the Constitution, but also rejects the kind of pomp and circumstance that often attaches to the power of the state. While Burke argues that elevating the institutions and great persons of the state with majesty and sober pomp helps form the crucial sentimental attachments and ennoble the whole enterprise of politics, Paine calls it all a means to disguise the fundamental injustice and unreasonableness of the regime. He seeks to desentimentalize politics. The haughty pretensions of the aristocracy are ridiculous, he says. Titles are but nicknames, and every nickname is a title. And the self-importance of the monarchy is ludicrous. I compare it to something kept behind a curtain, about which there is a great deal of bustle and fuss, and a wonderful air of seeming solemnity. But when, by any accident, the curtain happens to be open, and the company see what it is, they burst into laughter. Burke does not disagree with the notion that exposing the monarchy to ridicule would weaken it. But for him, this is precisely the reason for treating it solemnly. The seeming solemnity is truer and more valuable to human nature than the laughter. But Paine rejects this as an insult to human nature. As to Mr. Burke, he writes, he is a stickler for monarchy. He has taken up a contemptible opinion of mankind, who, in their turn, are taking up the same of him. He considers them as a herd of beings that must be governed by fraud, effigy, and show, and an idol would be as good a figure of monarchy with him as a man. The revolutionaries expressed their higher views of man by putting aside these demeaning displays. The patriots of France have discovered in good time that rank and dignity in society must take a new ground. The old one has fallen through. It must now take the substantial ground of character instead of the chimerical ground of titles. And they have brought their titles to the altar and made of them a burnt offering to reason, Paine writes. If all the pretensions and chimeras of the aristocracy were dropped, and if the political principles laid bare by reason were allowed to govern, Paine believed that the concerns to which Burke's correctives were directed would prove unfounded. A politics of reason, Paine argues, will largely resolve what may appear to be inherent tensions in human nature. Mistaken principles of government and the regimes built on them were the essential causes of human problems like poverty and war. If reason were unleashed, it would first demonstrate to the people that the principles are false, and so the systems are illegitimate. I do not believe that monarchy and aristocracy will continue 7 years longer in any of the enlightened countries in Europe, Paine wrote in 1792. If better reasons can be shown for them than against them, they will stand. If the contrary, they will not. And once the reasons have been arrayed and the old governments brought down, new regimes better founded in reason will resolve what have always seemed intractable problems. The existence of desperate poverty in many countries, Paine writes, lies not in any natural defect in the principles of civilization, but in preventing those principles having a universal operation, the consequence of which is a perpetual system of war and expense that drains the country and defeats the general felicity of which civilization is capable. He later argues, if men will permit themselves to think as rational beings ought to think, nothing can appear more ridiculous and absurd, exclusive of all moral reflections, than to be at the expense of building navies, filling them with men, and then hauling them into the ocean to try which can sink each other fastest. Peace, which costs nothing, is attended with infinitely more advantage than any victory with all its expense. But this, though it best answers the purpose of nations, does not that of court governments, whose habited policy is pretense for taxation, places, and offices. When all the governments of Europe shall be established on the representative system, nations will become acquainted, and the animosities and prejudices fomented by the intrigue and artifice of courts will cease. The oppressed soldier will become a free man, and the tortured sailor, no longer dragged through the streets like a felon, will pursue his mercantile voyage in safety. Paine believed fervently that war was grounded in the consequences of error and of intentional denial of the truth. In an age of reason, war will become a thing of the past. Once the proper political principles are put into effect, there will remain only questions of opinion and preference. These questions will range from the more minor details of the institutions of the regime, the more major ones being in fact questions of principle, to other, less significant momentary questions of policy and will. They may not be answered by direct recourse to abstract principle, but in a system designed in line with such principles, these questions of opinion will be resolved very efficiently by rational democratic deliberation and swift trial and error. No error will continue long, Paine writes. It will sometimes happen that the minority are right and the majority are wrong, Paine writes. But as soon as experience proves this to be the case, the minority will increase to a majority, and the error will reform itself by the tranquil operation of freedom of opinion and equality of rights. As long as the broad structure and principle of the regime is properly established and reason is free to reign, the people will choose well. Paine realizes, of course, that no system will be perfect. He acknowledges, too, that changing circumstances will require changes in the law, even when the government is founded on the right principles. He approves of the provisions in the U.S. and French constitutions allowing for amendment on these grounds. Though he believes that reasoned principles should shape the regime, the subject to which that reason is applied changes with time, so the laws must too. It is perhaps impossible to establish anything that combines principles with opinions and practice, which the progress of circumstances, through a length of years, will not in some measure derange or render inconsistent, Paine writes. But these deficiencies will be modest and will be quickly noticed and corrected, provided that the overall system of government is established on the principles of equality and representation and that the people are left free to employ their reason to political problems without deception or oppression. When prejudice and habit are replaced with rational examination and the application of principle in politics, the age of reason, though not a perfectly untroubled paradise, will enjoy peace, prosperity, and progress. Indeed, the progressive character of the transformation Paine envisions is crucial to his larger case. He believes that the Enlightenment project will unleash human reason long kept in chains. It will unseat the institutions and practices that have caused the most profound human problems and replace them with institutions and practices that will further empower reason over human affairs. Moreover, Paine believes that once empowered, human reason will allow for a continuing series of good judgments and choices. These positive developments, Paine believes, represent the outset of a great forward motion in history, a future that will get better and better as improvements build on one another. This view informs Paine's openness to the possibility of improvement in political institutions, even over those he himself proposes. The best constitution that could now be devised, consistent with the condition of the present moment, may be far short of that excellence which a few years may afford, he writes. The age of reason is only dawning, and because knowledge once learned cannot be unlearned, this type of political transformation will not be reversed, but will advance with time. Guided by reason, the new free republican institutions will champion the cause of rights, justice, commerce, science, and knowledge, and these will each build upon the others. It is truly an unprecedented time. Rather than look back for guidance, Paine argues we must look to reason, and with its help, move forward. Paine rejects Burke's charge that because he, Paine, always looks forward, his cause will always lack for concrete proof of its effectiveness. Paine, too, wants to prove his political philosophy by its effects, not just by speculation. When it shall be said in any country in the world, "My poor are happy," neither ignorance nor distress is to be found among them. My jails are empty of prisoners, my streets of beggars. The aged are not in want, the taxes are not oppressive. The rational world is my friend, because I am the friend of its happiness. When these things can be said, then may that country boast its constitution and its government. His claim to be able to bring about such effects must be largely prospective, since he champions an untried innovation, while Burke speaks for a long-established constitution. Paine, therefore, seeks to prove by reason that what he advocates will bring about a progressive transformation of social life. But in the debate over the French Revolution, when Paine's heralding of reason was at its height, he did also point to a crucial and prominent practical success of his principles. He pointed to America. Both during and after the American Revolution, Paine understood and explained the Revolution in terms of universal principles and the march of reason and rights. It therefore served for him as the first example of an enactment of his kind of Enlightenment vision of politics, and as the model for what he hoped might happen in France and beyond. And yet for Burke, the same American crisis offered a case study in a nearly opposite view of human reason and its place in public affairs. The meaning of America. Burke and Paine were in effect on the same side of the American question, the side eventually of independence for the colonies. But as becomes most clear in light of their differences about reason and politics, they were moved by starkly opposed analyses of the events in question and their significance. The independence of America, considered merely as a separation from England, would have been a matter of but little importance had it not been accompanied by a revolution in the principles and practice of governments. Paine asserted a decade after the American Revolution in Rights of Man. She made a stand, not for herself only, but for the world, and looked beyond the advantages herself could receive. For Paine, from his very earliest public writings about America until the very end of his life, the American story was a story of the vindication of Enlightenment reason and the principles it helps to uncover. As we have seen, he began his call for American independence in common sense with a case for Enlightenment, liberal equality, and liberty. And Paine was always keen to make clear that the essence of the cause was a matter of principle, not mere practical exigency. The cause of America is, in the greatest measure, the cause of all mankind, he declares. When in 1782, the Abbé Raynal, a French priest and scholar, wrote a short book on the still ongoing American Revolutionary War, accusing the Americans of revolting over nothing greater than a petty tax complaint, Paine responded with a heated public letter to the abbot, asserting the essentially principled character of the struggle. The American Revolution, he argued, was an utterly novel political act, unlike any seen before in history. Here the value and quality of liberty, the nature of government, and the dignity of man were known and understood, and the attachment of the Americans to these principles produced the revolution as a natural and unavoidable consequence. They had no particular family to set up or pull down. Nothing of personality was incorporated with their cause. At issue, instead, was the vindication of reason and principle. The true idea of a great nation is that which extends and promotes the principles of universal society, Paine writes. What the Americans had begun, far from a mere petty squabble among Englishmen, would be distinguished by opening a new system of extended civilization. By their claim to authority over the colonies without the extension of voting rights and other protections, the English had opened the question of rational liberty, and the people of America were uniquely well suited to understand the question and its proper answer, and to act on that understanding. Once independent, they would establish a model of republicanism that undoubtedly would attract the attention and the emulation of others, and would demonstrate that the principles of Enlightenment rationalism could offer solid foundations for a thriving political community. Over the subsequent 2 decades, as, albeit not without obstacles and hiccups, the American experiment did indeed appear to have been well launched, Paine resorted constantly to the model of America as an example of the potential of his revolutionary principles. The Americans succeeded not for reasons specific or local to them. On the contrary, circumstances were much arrayed against them. They succeeded because they had employed the proper principles for founding a new regime. In 1792, Paine put it this way: if there is a country in the world where concord, according to common calculation, would be least expected, it is America. Made up, as it is, of people from different nations, accustomed to different forms and habits of government, speaking different languages, and more different in their modes of worship, it would appear that the union of such a people was impracticable. But by the simple operation of constructing government on the principles of society and the rights of man, every difficulty retires, and all the parts are brought into cordial unison. There the poor are not oppressed, the rich are not privileged. Industry is not mortified by the splendid extravagance of a court rioting at its expense. Their taxes are few because their government is just, and as there is nothing to render them wretched, there is nothing to engender riots and tumults. America is the very thing that Burke insists is lacking in Paine's argument: concrete proof in the life of a real community that Paine's principles of government can work in practice. This evidence allows him to turn the tables and accuse Burke of ignoring actual circumstances in favor of abstract worries. With characteristic flourish, Paine argues in Rights of Man that a metaphysical man like Mr. Burke would have tortured his invention to discover how the Americans could be governed. He would have supposed that some must be managed by fraud, others by force, and all by some contrivance, that genius must be hired to impose upon ignorance and show and parade to fascinate the vulgar. Instead of all this sound and fury, Paine argues, the Americans chose the simplicity of reason and Enlightenment liberal principles, and have shown by their success that nothing more is needed, and that other regimes, founded on other principles, are needlessly oppressive and unjust. One of the great advantages of the American Revolution has been that it led to a discovery of the principles and laid open the imposition of governments. All the revolutions till then had been worked within the atmosphere of a court and never on the great floor of a nation. The American Revolution was a practical experiment in the new science of government, and one that proved the efficacy of its principles and its understanding of human reason in politics. But Edmund Burke drew more or less the opposite lesson from the story of American independence. He was deeply involved in the British debate over America and was quite possibly the most prominent and vocal of the Friends of America in Parliament. But Burke never attributes a philosophical character to the views and actions of the Americans. Not once in his public or known private writings on the subject does he refer to the events in America as a revolution, referring always to the American crisis, the American War, or even describing the events as a civil war. In his view, it was the English, not the Americans, who had broken with prescription in the name of merely speculative theoretical claims about government by imposing an unprecedented regime of taxation and limits on commerce in America, on the premise that Parliament had an unlimited authority to govern colonial affairs directly. The Americans, in his view, merely sought to continue and preserve the traditions of the English Constitution and the privileges they had always enjoyed. Burke does worry that the example of the Americans so ably pursuing their independence and seemingly suffering so little for it might move others around the world to attempt it, but he does not attribute the appeal of their example to any philosophical underpinnings of their cause, and he blames only the British for provoking it. The Americans were defending their long-standing implicit rights and the nature of their past relationship with London. They wanted continuity, and Parliament would not allow it. Burke, in effect, reads the second half of the Declaration of Independence, a document he surely knew but scrupulously avoids mentioning, and not the first, while Paine does the opposite. In fact, Burke's case against the actions of the British government involved some of his clearest and most adamant defenses of prescription against abstract reason, all directed against the English, not the Americans. The move to tax the colonies for revenue, rather than merely to control Britain's international trade, that is, the move from customs and tariffs to internal taxation of consumption, was utterly unprecedented, and it was this novelty, not the cost of the tax, that alarmed the Americans and moved them to resist, he argued. Whatever the right might have been, this mode of using it was absolutely new in policy and practice. The move was defended by Lord North's administration on the grounds that Parliament has every right to tax the colonies in any way it wished. The principles of sovereignty and the charters of the colonies permitted it. Burke never denied this point. He only argued that politics must take account of more than abstract principles. The question with me is not whether you have a right to render your people miserable, Burke told the Parliament, but whether it is not in your interest to make them happy. It is not what a lawyer tells me I may do, but what humanity, reason, and justice tell me I ought to do. The Americans had lived for many years essentially as Englishmen, with the apparatus of self-rule and a developed sense of independence. When Parliament decided, without involving them in consultation, to alter the scheme of their taxation, It rudely reminded them of the limits of their independence in what amounted to a needless provocation. People must be governed in a manner agreeable to their temper and disposition, Burke writes, and men of free character and spirit must be ruled with at least some condescension to this spirit and this character. Rather than break so harshly with the grain of American sentiments, Parliament could instead have increased the levies on trade and thereby improved its revenue without disturbing the Americans. Burke insisted they would have stood for it because they were used to it. Men do bear the inevitable constitution of their original nature with all its infirmities, he argued. The Act of Navigation of 1660 attended the colonies from their infancy, grew with their growth, and strengthened with their strength. They were confirmed in obedience to it, even more by usage than by law. Being right in principle was no excuse for being wrong in practice, and Burke warned Parliament that forgetting this truth would carry heavy costs, because it would move the Americans to question their entire relationship with London. Precisely because he did not believe the Americans were making a case against prescription or raising genuine threats to the regime, as he believed did occur in France in the following decade, Burke thought it terribly unwise for the English to break with the patterns of their past practices. Again and again in 1775 and early 1776, Burke implored the Commons to pay attention to the true nature and the peculiar circumstances of the conflict, because, he argued, whether we will or not, we must govern America according to that nature and to those circumstances, and not according to our own imaginations, not according to abstract ideas of right, by no means according to mere general theories of government, the resort to which appears to me, in our present situation, no better than arrant trifling. In time, this line of argument caused Burke to conclude that the Americans should be allowed to go their separate way, as Parliament had pushed too hard against the grain of the American character and the English Constitution, and left no hope of reconciliation. Human affections, he argued, on this front as on others, were the key to any functional society, and once disaffection takes hold, social and political bonds have little hope of surviving. Burke said and wrote remarkably little about America after the end of the war in 1783. Unlike Paine, he did not resort to the American crisis for an example in later political struggles. His only extended reference to it was in a passage of the Appeal from the New to the Old Whigs in 1791. In this discussion, he essentially restates his case against the government's policy in the American crisis and his belief, affirmed, he says, by conversations with Benjamin Franklin in London, that the Americans did not want independence or pursue affirmation of philosophical principles, but rather reacted understandably to an unwise provocation. The Americans stood at that time in the same relation to England as England did to King James II in 1688, Burke writes. For both Burke and Paine, the American crisis served as proof of their very different understandings of reason and political change. Paine's case for American independence is a case for a politics of Enlightenment reason and rational principle. Burke's case for American independence is a case for prudence and prescription. In championing opposing sides of the question of the French Revolution a decade later, each man made almost exactly the same case he had argued about America. Their agreement over America reflected quite different understandings of events there, while their disagreement over France reflected a general agreement over what the French revolutionaries were up to. In both cases, Burke and Paine disagreed profoundly about human nature, political change, and the proper relation of reason and politics. Debating reason. Throughout his public and private writings on a range of political subjects over several decades, Thomas Paine offers an extensive and determined case for the supremacy of unaided, individual human reason as understood by Enlightenment liberalism, over habit and tradition. With this assertion comes the need to subject every political institution, practice, question, and ideal to the rational inspection of every individual. Because society and politics answer to rational and universal principles, they must be answerable to the reason of one and all, he argues. Throughout his own many political writings, speeches, and letters in the same period, Edmund Burke offers vigorous objections to this mode of thinking about politics. These objections are grounded in his very different view of human nature, political life, and the limits of reason. Burke offers a case for political action guided by prescription and aimed at gradual change in response to particular felt needs. This approach to politics makes up for limited knowledge and the permanent limits of reason through a reliance on past precedents and an aggregation of individual views in, inevitably partisan, politics. This dispute between universal principles and historical precedents, between a politics of explicit knowledge and a politics of implicit knowledge, cuts to the core of the debate that still defines our politics. To this day, progressive voices argue that our political system must empower expertise to directly address social and political problems with technical prowess. And today's conservatives argue that we must empower institutions, like families, churches, and markets, that channel the implicit knowledge of many individuals and generations, and that have passed some test of time and contain in their very forms more wisdom than any person could possess. This dispute, which Burke and Paine made so explicit, is another version of the disagreement about whether political thought must consider abstract, solitary, rational individuals, or must take up particular human societies in their social and historical settings. The question forms a unifying thread throughout the Burke-Paine debate. As they argue about reason, Burke and Paine disagree about the given past and its relation to the present, about whether the circumstances that greet us when we enter the world can legitimately make demands on the way we think about politics. These disagreements combine into a deep difference over the nature of political change and improvement. Their differing assessments of the nature of events in America masks this dispute somewhat. But as the age of revolutions approached its climax in France, Burke's and Paine's differences rose swiftly to the surface and shaped a heated public debate between them. The disagreement over reason and prescription is at its core an argument about the theoretical or conceptual foundations of politics. But Burke's and Paine's two positions have very practical consequences when applied to political change. From reason and prescription, and from the views of human nature and society on which they draw, Paine and Burke arrive at the arguments for which they are best known, the arguments for revolution and reform. Chapter 6: Revolution and Reform. Burke and Paine were keenly aware that political ideas pointed to political action. Both men were writers and thinkers, but both were also deeply involved in political affairs at a time when the links between ideas and action were unusually clear. Their political ideas, therefore, point toward two views of political action and change, with Burke drawing on his vision of prescription to make the case for slow, incremental reform, and Paine building on his case for a rational politics to argue that only a wholly new beginning from first principles can redeem an illegitimate government. These views were evident in Burke's and Paine's writings from their earliest political engagements, and follow plainly, as we have seen, from their reflections on society and man. But they came to the fore most forcefully in the period of the French Revolution, when the question of just how the means and the ends of political change were related became suddenly urgent and prominent. Burke and Paine were better prepared than most of their contemporaries to take up these questions, and the passion and intensity with which they did so have ever since defined their legacies. Paine's Revolution for Justice. Thomas Paine was a self-declared and unabashed revolutionary. To have a share in two revolutions is living to some purpose, he proudly wrote to George Washington. That purpose, from Paine's earliest political exploits to the end of his life, was the cause of justice, pursued by an application of reason and principle to government. And as we have seen, Paine believed that such an application must begin from the beginning, so that a profoundly corrupt or broken regime needs to be replaced rather than mended. Again and again, he expresses disgust with the excuses illegitimate governments make for their mistreatment of their people in an effort to hold on to power. As time obliterated the history of their beginning, he writes of the despots who founded every old nation, their successors assumed new appearances to cut off the entail of their disgrace, but their principles and objects remained the same. It is simply not possible to fix discrete problems in regimes of this sort, because the principle of despotism has soaked through into every corner and crevice. When despotism has established itself for ages in a country, as in France, Paine writes, the original hereditary despotism resident in the person of the king divides and subdivides itself into 1,000 shapes and forms, till at last the whole of it is acted by deputation. Nothing short of a total remedy can address such a profound corruption of government. To speak of revolution, therefore, is for Paine to speak of overthrow, of the lifting up of the burden of generations of misrule and iniquity, leaving only the society itself essentially in its natural state. Paine was under no illusion that such a general revolution would be easy, nor did he take lightly the risks and problems it entailed. Mischief is more easily begun than ended, he writes, and revolutions will always carry behind them a train of mischief. He insists, therefore, that he is not enamored of revolutions for their own sake. As a general matter, he writes, it is better to obey a bad law, making use at the same time of every argument to show its errors and procure its repeal, than forcibly to violate it. Only when the regime is so fundamentally corrupt as to make the very idea of a good law impossible is more extreme action required. Paine is careful to emphasize this caveat because he wants to be perfectly clear that a government established on the proper principles, not the revolution required to get to such a government, is the goal of his efforts. It is in the first place necessary that we distinguish between the means made use of to overthrow despotism in order to prepare the way for the establishment of liberty, and the means to be used after the despotism is overthrown. The aim of the revolution is to establish a new order, not a permanent revolutionary state, and only the promise of that new order, together with the abuses of the old one, justifies the revolution. It is an insurrection that aims at the establishment of some stable political arrangement. The authority of the present assembly is different from what the authority of future assemblies will be, Paine writes of the French Parliament in the early stages of the Revolution. The authority of the present one is to form a constitution. The authority of future assemblies will be to legislate according to the principles and forms prescribed in that constitution. And if experience should hereafter show that alterations, amendments, or additions are necessary, the Constitution will point out the mode by which such things shall be done, and not leave it to the discretionary power of the future government. But for all these caveats, the mandate Paine describes for revolution is exceptionally broad, because he faults the very idea of monarchical and hereditary government, and not just the particular abuses of particular regimes, for leaving man in a wretched condition. In some writings, particularly in the first part of Rights of Man, written while some of the French revolutionaries, including Paine's friend the Marquis de Lafayette, were still trying to retain some symbolic role for the king in the new regime, and therefore written with some caution, Paine reluctantly acknowledges the right of the people to choose a monarch. But by the height of the French Revolution, and very clearly by the second part of Rights of Man, which was written a little over a year after the first, he declares himself an uncompromising Republican. All hereditary government is in its nature tyranny, Paine writes, and passionately attacks the very notion of monarchy and hereditary aristocracy. When legitimate governments are established around the world, revolution should be scarce, and citizens should seek to redress grievances by persuasion and legislation. But as long as that is not the case, which it was not in his time in any country except America and revolutionary France, Paine believed, the only remedy at hand was to begin again. The old European regimes were simply no longer adequate in the era of modern knowledge about politics. Whether the forms and maxims of governments which are still in practice were adapted to the condition of the world at the period they were established is not, in this case, the question, Paine writes. The older they are, the less correspondence can they have with the present state of things. Time and change of circumstances and opinions have the same progressive effect in rendering modes of government obsolete as they have upon customs and manners. The advance of knowledge and civilization, themselves aided by the advance of modern reason and science, make the inadequacy and illegitimacy of old regimes increasingly acute, and the illegitimacy itself can only be addressed by total revolution. In practice, therefore, Paine argues that the moment requires a complete and utterly new political beginning. People in every nation must throw off the old governments that burden them and must begin again from their social foundations, this time constructing political institutions in accord with the principles of equality, choice, and representation made evident by reason. Paine's idea of revolution is thus less a remedy to a particular set of social and political grievances, and more a response to the absence of proper political foundations. He wants to see a return to the natural society that he believes precedes the formation of government, and from that point, the construction of entirely new institutions and practices, unconnected to any that have existed in the old regime. This requires the design and implementation of thoroughly novel social and political forms. Continuity with the old regimes would itself be proof of the inadequacy of reform. A constitution, in order to work well, must be a novelty, and that which is not a novelty must be defective, Paine writes. Nothing of the prior regime should be retained, and it makes very little sense to look at even more ancient models, like those of Greece and Rome, in establishing a new regime. Mankind have lived to very little purpose if, at this period of the world, they must go 2,000 or 3,000 years back for lessons and examples. Instead, we must look not to history, but to our new understanding of nature and of the principles of justice and society, and begin nothing less than a rebirth. Clearly, given both his enthusiasm for revolution and his caveats regarding the limited circumstances under which it could be called for, Paine believed that what matters most is what the revolution builds, not what it tears down, and he was careful to make this point explicit too. In contemplating revolutions, he notes in Rights of Man, it is easy to perceive that they may arise from two distinct causes. The one to avoid or get rid of some great calamity, the other to obtain some great and positive good. He continues, in those which proceed from the former cause, the temper becomes incensed and soured, and the redress obtained by danger is too often sullied by revenge. But in those which proceed from the latter, the heart, rather animated than agitated, enters serenely upon the subject. Reason and discussion, persuasion and conviction, become the weapons in the contest, and it is only when those are attempted to be suppressed that recourse is had to violence. When men unite in agreeing that a thing is good could it be obtained, such for instance as relief from a burden of taxes and the extinction of corruption, the object is more than half accomplished. What they approve as the end, they will promote in the means. Yet even in this very passage, Paine betrays the difficulty of distinguishing destruction and construction in his view of the world. The positive goods he calls upon as examples are relief from burdensome taxes and the extinction of corruption, both of which are in fact negative goods. Because he believes a legitimate government can fall into line with the rational and natural order of things, he considers injustice a kind of imposition. Therefore, the enactment of justice is the removal of a burden. The good is the elimination of the bad. For this reason, Paine's revolutionary writing is in fact almost entirely devoted to the enterprise of bringing down despots and tyrants. Revolution is the elimination of impositions and burdens, which in practice requires the total elimination of the governments responsible for them. Paine believes that since governing is essentially intellectual work, people have the ability to build a proper government from scratch, provided they respect the principles of individual equality and liberty. But the necessary prior task of dismantling a despotic regime is a much more difficult challenge that requires immense political exertion, courage, and commitment. He sees himself, above all, called to contribute to meeting this challenge, an effort that requires the best and the brightest in an oppressed society, all that extent of capacity which never fails to appear in revolutions, to help the people see their way to understanding the failings of their government and to argue for a return to beginnings for the construction of an alternative. Paine believed his particular talent for political argument was especially well suited to the nature of the challenge, which required a kind of awakening. The forms and habits of the old regime can easily disguise its fundamental injustice from the people, since people, after all, tend to love their country and its symbols and forms, and so will bear a lot of pain out of habit. But, Paine writes, it is, however, curious to observe how soon this spell can be dissolved. A single expression, boldly conceived and uttered, will sometimes put a whole company into their proper feelings, and whole nations are acted on in the same manner. Properly disillusioned and then instructed in the proper principles of government, every nation has the capacity to liberate itself through revolution and replace a decrepit despotism with a free regime. It is in this sense that Paine famously assures his fellow Americans in 1776 that we have it in our power to begin the world over again. We have it in our power to shake loose of old presumptions, begin from the correct first principles, and so construct a proper government. Put this way, Paine's revolutionary ethic turns out to be, in its means as well as its ends, an applied form of his theory of political life. He seeks to institute change by starting over from scratch, just as he seeks to assess political arrangements by looking back to first origins. He wants to take the method of reasoning about politics employed by Enlightenment liberalism and turn it into a method of acting on politics. Because his idea of revolution is grounded in principle in this way, and involves a kind of liberation of man's nature from the oppression of false ideas and tyrannical government, Paine believes that its progress will be essentially unstoppable once the obstacles of the old regimes are properly removed. Government founded on a moral theory, on a system of universal peace, on the indefeasible hereditary rights of man, is now revolving from west to east by a stronger impulse than the government of the sword revolved from east to west, he writes. It interests not particular individuals, but nations in its progress, and promises a new era to the human race. This is a revolution concerned not with the replacement of one leader with another. It is moved not by hatred of one king or preference for another, but by the desire for justice enabled by a search for the truth. Even as things turned sour in France, and Paine found himself imprisoned for nearly a year by the revolutionary regime for associating with insufficiently radical factions, he continued to argue that the proper principles were there to be applied, and that any failures of the revolution were merely failures to apply them fully and properly. All the disorders that have arisen in France during the progress of the revolution have had their origin not in the principle of equal rights, but in the violation of that principle, he wrote in 1795. 9 years later, having seen the collapse of his great dream and the rise of Napoleon, Paine told a group of French-speaking inhabitants of Louisiana, "You see what mischief ensued in France by the possession of power before they understood principles? They earned liberty in words, but not in fact." The writer of this was in France through the whole of the Revolution, and knows the truth of what he speaks, for after endeavoring to give it principle, he had nearly fallen victim to its rage. To the extent the Revolution did not fully succeed, Paine concludes it was because it was incomplete, not, as Burke might suggest, because it sought a complete enactment of an inadequate and excessively speculative vision. This view makes Paine a thoroughgoing revolutionary, well before the idea of the revolutionary as a political character or type had come into vogue. Believing that political change must be total and uncompromising, he is excited by the prospect of overthrowing the existing order so that a new and more rational one may sprout in its place. Paine was exceptionally frank about his advocacy for total revolution, especially once he was ensconced in France. He saw all resistance to a complete new beginning as an expression of corruption or of some invidious private motive, and believed that during the exceptional period of the Revolution, resistance and opposition must be squashed for the good of the cause. It is important to understand how far beyond the liberalism of most English Whigs Paine went by espousing these views. By rejecting monarchy in principle, he allied himself with the fringe of the English radicals of the day, but even most of those radicals never went as far to suggest the abolition of the monarchy in Britain itself. For Paine, despotism was the result of a failure to fully apply the principles of liberty in practice, and so the liberal principles that had emerged from the Whig worldview necessitated an unbending republicanism. It was in this context that in his final letter to Burke on January 17, 1790, Paine wrote of the zeal of the revolutionaries and their determination to destroy themselves or their country rather than abandon their revolutionary plan. It is easy to see why Paine was excited. The events he described in the opening months of the French Revolution perfectly embodied his view of how meaningful political change must occur and how a regime properly grounded in Enlightenment rationalism ought to replace an ancient monarchy. The very same events, however, also gave perfect expression to his correspondent's worst fears and deepest worries. Burke's and Paine's sharp differences were never clearer than at the outset of the Revolution in France. This audiobook is continued on Disc 8.